Welcome to Employment Connections. My name is Richard Retha with the APH Connect Center. We are going to stop the recording now so we can do the accreditation, the credits. All right. Well, everybody, welcome to our inaugural Employment Connections. My name is Richard Retha with the APH Connect Center. Employment Connections is our brand new offering for CareerConnect and the Connect Center, and we are very proud to have very many people attend live. And for those watching later on YouTube, thank you. We hope that Employment Connections, and we plan that Employment Connections will be for you, our audience members, to take back to your classrooms, to your students, and for you, the job seeker, really wanting to explore what it means to be employed. And today we're going to talk about disclosure. Our plans with Employment Connections is to offer this quarterly through our webinar, and we will give you, our audience members, the opportunity to ask questions during the second half of the hour. So as you think of questions, as you hear of the discussion today with Lori and Russell, feel free to put those questions in the chat, and Katie will definitely field them for us. So Lori Shaffer is our CareerConnect content lead, and we are very pleased to have Russell Shaffer, Executive Vice President of Strategy and Programs with Disability In. And I'm going to hand it off to them. Russell and Lori, good afternoon and welcome to Employment Connections.
You, Richard. And thank you, everybody, for attending Employment Connections this evening. Russell and I are going to start by having a conversation about disability during the employment process and at what various points may that occur. So, for example, somebody may disclose in their cover letter or on their resume, based on information that they share, that they have a disability. And there could be some pros and cons to that. Russell, would you like to talk about that a little and discuss other places that you may find disclosure occurring?
Sure thing, Lori. Good evening, everyone. I, again, am Russell Shaffer, Executive Vice President of Strategy and Programs at Disability In. I am also a member of the Board of Trustees for the American Printing House for the Blind. And I am super excited not only to be a guest for Employment Connections, but also as a trustee and somebody who spend my days working on disability inclusion. To see this program and to have the opportunity to talk about topics like self-disclosure and to really just try to answer some questions and provide perspective on topics related to getting more people with disabilities into employment and moving up through their careers. Before I dive into Lori's question, I'll just offer, I know there are differing views on image descriptions. However, for those who might find a visual description helpful or beneficial, I'll just offer that I am a Caucasian man in my early 40s. I keep my hair closely cropped and shaved. I'm wearing a blue long sleeve button-up shirt, and I am in my home office in Rogers, Arkansas. So hopefully, if that was helpful to give you a little bit of context of who I am and where I'm coming from, that was for which it was intended. But Lori, I think to get to your question around self-disclosure, I think for me the most important thing to establish right out of the gate is that self-disclosure is a completely personal decision. And
yes,
if to disclose or not to disclose, when or how to disclose, should be entirely up to the individual. I'm not going to tell you should disclose. Nobody else should tell anyone else that they should disclose, because ultimately a person's circumstances and situation and scenario is unique to them. And if you don't feel comfortable self-disclosing, it's probably not going to land well. It's really got to be something for which you feel good about. And so, we were talking before we started the program kind of about how you can think about self-disclosure and kind of define it. And I like to think about it in two different ways. There's explicit disclosure and implicit disclosure. And so explicit disclosure is quite simply when you actively seek to directly communicate about your disability to someone, either verbally or through written communication, perhaps is part of an interview, with a HR manager, or recruiter, or the hiring manager to disclose about your disability and talk about it, or to put your disability experience intentionally in your cover letter, or in some other form of interaction and engagement with a potential employer with intentionality, either written or verbally. But then there's implicit disclosure, and these are the types of disclosures that somebody might be able to infer based upon elements of your resume or cover letter or interview answers or your social media. So think about things like where you went to school. For instance, if you have an individual who's deaf, who went to Gallaudet University, which predominantly serves the deaf population, that might be an implicit disclosure that you might be deaf. If you talk about being part of the disability resource group at a past employer, that might be an implicit disclosure. If you talk about being the secretary of your local chapter of ACB or NFB, American Council of the Blind, National Federation of the Blind, that might be an implicit disclosure. If you've got pictures of yourself at a disability event on your social media, that might be an implicit disclosure. And so thinking about those things critically in terms of, I might not want to explicitly disclose or actively disclose about my disability. I might not be comfortable doing that. But what is my resume? What's my social media? What are other things saying about me that somebody might infer? And if you've got a lot of implicit disclosure going on, you might want to strongly think about explicitly disclosing in order to control the narrative. For somebody to kind of draw conclusions based upon where you went to school or the organizations that you're involved in is going to potentially impact how they perceive you and think about the way in which you are presenting yourself as a candidate for a position. And so it's a real opportunity for you to then think about do I take control of the narrative, and either in my cover letter or in my interview or in some way, shape, or form actively and explicitly disclose that I'm a person with a disability.
Yes, and there also are times when disclosing a disability could help have you being considered when you disclose in a cover letter or a resume. For example, if you're applying for a job in an independent living center or to work in an area that's directly related to people with disabilities, things like that, that is a good way to get your resume recognized. And it's important to think of that side of things as well. So sometimes depending on what type of job you're applying for is going to depend on when you're going to disclose or how you're going to disclose. Russell, thank you for bringing up controlling the dialogue and controlling the information that happens. Do you have any anything you'd like to share, whether it be personal experience or professional experience that you've come across where disclosure of disability, maybe some pros and some cons of the disclosure process, and at what point did those types of disclosure occur? Because disclosing a disability can happen in a cover letter, as we just discussed, a resume. It could happen when you walk in the door, and now the person that's been waiting to interview you had 5 nice questions, and now they're saying, oh, this person has a dog or a cane, or this person walks with a walker assisting them. And that may change their perception of you, and it may take them by surprise. So then you, as the person being interviewed, may have to counterbalance some of that. So that, is another aspect of disclosure, when you also may not have something that's visible. It may not be something that's not visible, isn't going to be obvious to an interviewer, but you may want to choose to disclose during the interview. So Russell, do you have anything to comment on in those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of thoughts, Lori. And so, again, for me personally, is somebody, executive vice president at Disability In, an organization focused on disability inclusion globally across corporations. Never have I worked somewhere where being a person with a disability is as much of a benefit as it is here, and the opportunity to disclose that proudly and to lead with that lived experience, where that experience is a value add to the work that I do. In much the way, Lori, you mentioned that it might be if you worked at a center for independent living or worked in other spaces directly related to disability. I have a colleague who I work with here at Disability In who I knew from a previous time in the corporate world, who I knew to be a person with a non-apparent disability, one that they hadn't broadly disclosed up until in their career, or they'd been very thoughtful about how they disclosed that disability. And when they reached out and were looking at an opportunity for employment here at Disability In, I had encouraged them that if you feel comfortable, now is the best time you'll ever have, and there's no better position than the one you're pursuing for you to actually lead with your disability and to present it as a value-added differentiator and an asset and a strength because of the perspective and experience that it provides you, that will help you understand the audience and the customer base, our partners that we're trying to serve better. And this individual did disclose, and they got the job, and they're able to live and lead in a much more authentic and open way with their disability because of where we work. I think that there's other opportunities, certainly from a corporate perspective. Corporations that are federal contractors that have Section 503 requirements to employ people with disabilities based on Office of Federal Contract Employment compliance programs requirements. They're in many instances looking for individuals to self-disclose in pre-employment because they have reporting requirements to the government on employment of people with disabilities. So identifying those companies that you might be looking to get hired at that are federal contractors, where self-disclosure might not necessarily be simply a neutral. It might actually be a positive in terms of affirmative action and giving you opportunities for employment in that regard. I also think that there's just that opportunity to level set on people's perspectives. I have a former colleague who is also blind, who was interviewing virtually for a position, and had several conversations with recruiters and hiring managers, and was invited to come in for an in-person interview and to fly in and do all of that. And the recruiting coordinator asked them if they would require a rental car, and he said no. And they kept asking, are you sure? And he kept responding with, no, I won't need a car. I'll find other forms of transportation when I get there. And so when he shows up for the interview and gets out of a taxi with his white cane, and the recruiter meets him at the door, her response was, oh, thank goodness, you're blind. And he's like, excuse me? And she's like, well, when you said you didn't need a rental car, I thought that perhaps you had a DUI and you didn't have an active driver's license, and that would be a non-employment outcome. But we can work with blind. So,
oh, that's funny.
Sometimes people have questions, and it goes back to the narrative piece and controlling the narrative. People are going to come to their own conclusions in their mind.
That's
Sometimes
true.
being blind or being a person with a disability is a much more palatable answer or outcome to the question being mentally asked than what somebody's coming up with on their own. Case in point, oh yeah, being blind is a lot better than you having a DUI.
It's an interesting story, Russell. Thank you for sharing that. I know of somebody who had an interview and it was virtual, and it was they were interviewing, and the person said, oh, I just emailed you something. And he said, yes, I'm reading it. And the person said, but I don't see your eyes moving. And he said, no, because I'm blind and I'm using a screen reader. And the person was like, oh, you're blind? And it wound up he did not get that job. However, they ended up entering into a totally different conversation about different skill sets that he had that were more advanced than the position he was being interviewed for. And a week later, he got a job offer from another department within the same company. Amazing. So, it's kind of funny how things happen. And interviews are hard enough. Everybody gets nervous and has a million questions and trying to think of how an interview is going to go running through their head, never mind the fact of disclosing your disability or not disclosing your disability. So it's just, there's so many ways that things can go.
Yeah, well, and I think, being, to that end, like one of the ways in which you can kind of slow that down is to be really intentional and thoughtful and practice and prepared. And, going in, while it is illegal for an potential employer to ask you questions about your disability, they can certainly ask you if you are able to perform the essentials of functions of the position with or without a reasonable accommodation. That they are legally allowed to ask you. However, just because they're not legally allowed to verbally ask you a question doesn't mean that they're not wondering the question in their head. And so for me, I've always found that for me, the best outcomes have been when I've left nothing to chance and left nothing on the table. I had a position that I was interviewing for many years ago that required extensive travel. And as a person who's blind, the minute I walked in the door for the in-person interview with the white cane, I knew that, like most of society, this hiring manager is probably going to wonder how I get around in the airport and how I travel. And with travel being such a key part of the job, they couldn't ask me that. But I knew that if I didn't answer it, that might be the difference between me getting the job or not. And so at the end of the interview, when I was given the opportunity to share, any additional comments, I said, I understand that this role has extensive travel. And I just want you to know that I'm perfectly comfortable and capable of traveling independently. And I then proceeded to talk a little bit about my routine and how I travel, and just to kind of establish that. And, and they said, thank you. And ultimately I got the job. And I'll never know whether I would or I wouldn't have gotten the job if I wouldn't have shared about how I travel. But I do know that I would have been leaving a lot more to chance by not sharing that than I did by actually sharing it.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think sometimes we have to weigh those considerations in our mind and raise something that a interviewer may have in their mind as a strength of ours. And while you took the issue of transportation and made it into a strength, that probably, was a great way to convince them that, yes, he is capable of doing this. But, no, we'll never know.
You'll never know.
Yeah. Yeah. So as somebody that works with Disability In, and also in your other positions that you've held in management, what are some pros or cons that we haven't really talked about that may be related to disclosing a disability? And you could cover anything from after somebody gets hired, because that's a whole other area. I think it's important for people that are with us this evening or joining us via YouTube to understand that, without disclosure of a disability, you lose protections related to your disability. So that is something also that does need to be looked at. I worked with a young lady as an intern in a former job, and very sadly, I was taking her during what would have been her senior year, midway through her first semester. And I should have known that there were and I said, okay, well, she has a disability. I don't have a problem with that. And the supervisor said to me, the internship supervisor said, well, you can't meet her. I'm going to look and see if there's enough space for her wheelchair. And then, she can start, if I can figure out if there's enough space for her wheelchair. And in my head, I was going like, well, I'd be really uncomfortable if somebody was going in somewhere on my behalf as a person who's blind. So anyway, I took on this intern, and sadly, it was to work as a social worker. And because of the significance in her disability, she did not have the ability to take notes on a client. She did not have the cognitive ability to remember enough information to have somebody else write her notes after meeting with a client. And I had a very hard decision to make. Within 2 weeks, I had to decide, well, within 2 weeks, I should say, I decided to let her go, because in that position, those were essential parts of the job. And I kept offering her up options. If we get a volunteer to take notes for you, do you want that? Nope, I don't need that. But she wasn't able to hold down everything on her own. And it was a very uncomfortable position for me, because I kept giving her options and she wasn't interested in taking those options. So ultimately we had to terminate her. So it is the type of thing where we need to think about the whole picture. So Russell, can you share some of your thoughts in the pros and cons type of thing when it comes to disclosing disability? And then we're going to turn it over to Katie and Richard and see what questions they may have. And anybody else can feel free to type into the chat.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely, Lord. I think, back to just reinforce, what we've already stated, the decision to self-disclose is a personal one, at any point in time,
yep.
in the employment process, from pre-employment, to interviewing to post-employment, and when or if,
Yes.
but when you think about it from a post-offer onboarding perspective, I think you hit it on the head there. One of the pros is that if you require reasonable accommodations, self-disclosure is how you initiate that process. The act of self-disclosure, be it to your supervisor, to your HR representative, to a central intake representative for accommodations within your organization, depending upon the type of your employer and the structure. You have to actively have a conversation or complete some sort of form that discloses that you are a person with a disability, and that is how you're able to receive those reasonable accommodations, and to be protected by the provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act, as Lori said. If you don't disclose, or you don't want accommodations, and then you're not performing, as is in the instance that Lori mentioned, then absent of those protections and those reasonable accommodations, that becomes a performance discussion and conversation that could lead to disciplinary actions and potential termination. And so, the pro certainly is to ensure that you get the accommodations, the productivity enhancements that you need to perform the essential functions of your job, and to be at your level best, and to be protected by the ADA. I think one of the other cons is that, if you are a person with a disability who requires accommodations, and you do not disclose that in the pre-employment process, and your disclosure is coming in on day one of a new job and requesting accommodations, particularly if there are accommodations that might take some time to get ordered, and you need those in order to be productive. Strong relationships, employee-employer relationships, are built on trust and transparency. And trust and transparency works both ways, and is at its best when it's reciprocal. And so I know that it's easy for me, as somebody who's employed, to say that if you choose to disclose, the earlier in the process that you do, oftentimes the better. But truly, if you show up on day one to a new job, and your employer was not expecting you to be a person who needs accommodations that might take several weeks to get put in place before you're able to be productive, yet you're being paid, that might not put you off on the right foot to start with your employers. Just really thinking intentionally about that, and coming to your own personal conclusions. And I think the other thing, in full candor, is you need to ask yourself, as you're assessing and evaluating an employment opportunity. Interviews also go both ways. You're being interviewed, but you're also interviewing a company. And if you don't feel comfortable or safe in self-disclosing your disability to this employer, potential employer, you need to ask yourself, is this a place I should be looking to work? If they don't have the type of culture and environment where I feel comfortable and safe in being authentic, and out with my disability, do I want to work here? Should I work here? And again, I recognize I have the privilege, as somebody who has a job, of making that sound super easy. I know and recognize that it's not. However, I think that the more we critically evaluate employers from that perspective and actively opt out of pursuing jobs at places that are not inclusive of people with disabilities, the more pressure we put on employers who are squeezed for talent to ensure that they are creating the type of inclusive culture where people with disabilities feel comfortable and safe to self-disclose at any point in the employment process.
That's so true, Russell. And I just want to share, I typically do not disclose in my cover letter. However, if you Google my name, you can figure out that I'm blind. If you look on social media, you can figure out that I'm blind. And I recently, within the past year, interviewed with a federal agency. And I knew that I would need to let them know that I would need a reader because their system, while they are the federal government, is not accessible with a screen reader. So I chose to disclose during the interview. And the irony is I got a job offer, but the refusal process didn't go through correctly when I turned the job down because there was a button that wasn't labeled. And I didn't know there was one thing that I didn't check until I used Ira to help me figure it out. So there is, and the way that I figured out they didn't get my refusal is Social Security. I didn't mean to say the name of the agency, but anyway, now everybody knows it was Social Security, called me at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning to make sure that I got the email they sent me. And, so it was pretty funny. And the woman was extremely apologetic when she realized what happened. And I felt bad because, you know, I'm sure they had other candidates. They had several positions, but I felt bad because they may have been able to offer it up to somebody else earlier if they knew that I had rejected their offer. So,
Lori, we've got quite a few questions queued up.
Yes, I was just going to say we're going to move on to questions. So I saw some great ones coming in.
There are, and they are continuing to come in, which is awesome. So keep my braille display jumping and keep those questions coming in, please. So we have one. We'll start off with a professional who was asked by a student today if it is better to disclose in person, face to face, or virtually, or through email. If you have thoughts on, maybe suggestions about that, how to handle that situation.
Yeah, I would say that it's situational and circumstantial. And if all of your interviews are taking place virtually and you might not meet somebody in person until you're already hired, if you do want to self-disclose, finding that way to do that some point in time during the virtual process would be better. And I think some of it also, depends upon your degree of vision loss. If vision loss is your disability, or if your disability is apparent or non-apparent. If you can quote unquote cover in person, that's different than if you're coming in with a service dog or a white cane or a wheelchair. That's an obvious disclosure. When you show up at the door, and the decision kind of is gone from you at that point in time on whether to disclose or not. And so it's different for everybody based upon your situation and circumstance. I think there's cases to be made for doing it virtually versus in person, and you just kind of have to weigh the pros and cons for each of your own scenarios.
The other thing is it's also what is the person comfortable with? I used to say when I would be called for an interview, I'll be taking the bus. What is your nearest cross street? Lots of people depending on where you live, lots of people take the bus. So it's also how you do it. And you know, sometimes I would find myself, they'd say, oh, well, it's the street near, and they'd name some place of a store, and I would have no clue where that was because they didn't know the street name. And I'd say, well, I really would need a street name. I'm blind. You know, it's kind of what are you comfortable with? But it's also, since that did come from a professional, I just want to say it is a skill to definitely work with students on, whether they're adults or children.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Another great question here, and this is really, I think, important for all of us to keep in mind, you know, when we're going through interviews. Someone normally discloses their disability during the interview, but wondering if you can give a few examples of questions that are legal and questions that are not legal to ask.
I am not a lawyer, so don't consider myself qualified to answer that question. What I will say is, to reinforce what I said earlier, is the question I know that is legal to ask is, are you able to perform the essential functions of the position with or without a reasonable accommodation?
Yeah. And just like Russell, I'm not a lawyer either. And I recently was working with somebody, and on the job application, it said, do you have a disability and will you need if you have a disability, will you need an accommodation? Please feel free to disclose. And I thought that was very nice, because if you needed an accommodation, say as a sign language interpreter, that would give you the ability to disclose right there that, you know, if you're going to interview me, this is what I need. And again, it would be up to the person to choose to disclose.
All right. So next we have someone who is going to be working at their high school's transition program for students with disabilities next year. But the person does not have much background on best practices or laws. Where would you suggest they start researching information on this topic?
Lots of wonderful places. I will
Yeah.
shamelessly plug the Disability In website, disabilityin.org. No spaces, no hyphens. We have a wealth of resources around accommodations and disability etiquette and other things out there, publicly available on our website. The government has a treasure trove of great websites as well. One that I particularly like a lot is JAN, or the Job Accommodation Network, which is a program of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. That it has a wealth of resources as well. So those would be a couple of things that I would suggest to get you started, and you'll find tons of links that will link you off to other things from there.
And if I could just add to that, there's also national transition working groups, both for disability specific, and there are some national groups as well. So you could definitely reach out. And APH also does have some material on transition activities and things like that.
Great. So next question is talking about how would, you know, obviously when you walk into an interview with a white cane or a guide dog, it's pretty obvious that you have, or in a wheelchair, you know, you have a visible disability. But what about maybe some mental disabilities, such as, you know, bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder? How would you maybe address some of those mental disability, you know, concerns in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think certainly again, that's one of those where it becomes situational and circumstantial, and for a lot of individuals with mental health disabilities, there might not necessarily be a clear and present need for a reasonable accommodation when it comes to performing the essential functions of the job. And so there might not be a tangible reason for self-disclosure in that regard, in the pre-employment and early employment process. And then I think in those instances, it really does become a matter of psychological safety and your own discretion on when or if to self-disclose. If there's a way in which your mental health might impact the way in which you interact with others, where disclosing your disability might provide context to your colleagues on how to interpret some of your behaviors, that could be beneficial. That could certainly be a reason for considering to self-disclose. However, if your disability, from your perspective, doesn't really have any bearing whatsoever on how you show up at work, then it might be something that you choose not to self-disclose. I think the other thing to bear in mind too is that whether we consciously realize it or not, particularly with a non-apparent disability, and as I was progressively losing my vision, there was a time where I could cover and I could decide whether or not I was going to disclose actively. Now that I have no usable vision left and I use a white cane, that decision is made for me. But as I reflect back on that time in my life and my career where I felt I could conceal my vision loss to a degree, it was exhausting, and I was constantly worried about, was somebody going to figure out my secret, if I didn't let them know, or was it obvious, was I just kidding myself, and all of these things. That is the cost of covering. There's an emotional tax and a cognitive load that comes with covering a non-apparent disability. And when you make the decision to self-disclose and you're fully open, you're not paying that cost anymore, that tax, and you're freed up in your cognitive space and your emotions to have deeper relationships with your colleagues, to focus more on your work and your productivity than trying to cover your disability. And for me, people talk about disclosing disability as a career limiting move. For me, disclosing my disability was a career advancing move. And I can only speak from my own experience, but I've been promoted a lot more times post disability disclosure than I was pre-disability disclosure. And for me, a big part of that was I just wasn't worried about all the energy spent on keeping that secret anymore.
Thank you. And that's a really great response. We have a lot of questions, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best. So we have someone that has some mild disabilities that aren't very apparent, and people have made assumptions about the person's, what they can do, or what may be wrong with them. What suggestions do you have for that individual?
Yeah, I think, again, I'll sound like a broken record. Not knowing the full extent of your situation, it's personal. But I had a colleague who, like myself, has retinitis pigmentosa, and was reluctant to disclose at work. And one day they just decided to pull the Band-Aid off completely and showed up at work with their brand new service dog to help them navigate the campus. They went from 0 to 100 in about 2.3 seconds. But she talked about how she had this one colleague that she interacted with who, when she came in with her service dog, she's like, this explains so much. Your low vision. I just thought you were rude and socially awkward. And so it kind of goes back to that people are filling in the gaps, and they're making assumptions and about how you behave and what you do that may or may not be true. And so self-disclosure gives you that opportunity to set the record straight and to control the narrative rather than, leaving stuff up to assumption, which, I don't need to make the crass statement of, well, what assuming makes both you and me
That's right.
out to be.
Great. That's an interesting point, to make that connection. So that's good. All right. Next, if a person does not disclose their disability in the application process, but does do so during an interview, does that affect their right to have reasonable accommodations?
So an individual has the right to request reasonable accommodations at any point during the employment process, pre-employment through post-employment.
But again,
right.
to go back to what Russell was saying, you also do need to be careful, because when it becomes a performance issue, that is a whole other ball of wax, a whole other. I saw a question come in, which I want to raise, not to steal Katie's job. The question was, if somebody needs a job coach during the interview process, how should this be handled? And Russell, what are your thoughts on that? I have some thoughts as well.
And Lori, we have another question about interview accommodations as well. So if we want to,
we can follow up with that one.
Back.
Yep.
I will preface by saying I am not an expert in supported employment and job coaches. That said, requesting a job coach as a reasonable accommodation certainly falls within what is covered by the ADA. And how I've typically seen that play out is if you need or require a job coach to help with interpretation of a question, taking what is asked and rephrasing it or restating it in terms that are more conducive to comprehension and understanding based upon your disability, that is a completely acceptable and reasonable accommodation where you cross the line into what is not acceptable and appropriate is to have a job coach in there who is answering for or speaking on behalf of an individual. If you are an interpreter who is providing for effective communication, or again, helping to restate or reframe questions for comprehension and understandability that somebody then answers for themselves, that is absolutely what a job coach is for and is within the purview of a reasonable accommodation.
All right. Next, we have a question about, can you talk a little bit about how to ask for reasonable accommodations for the interview process, what that might look like?
Yeah, I will just offer that every employer is different, and some will have a link or a form on pre-employment materials or interview schedules or language that will say something to the effect of, if you require a reasonable accommodation for any part of the interview or pre-employment process, here's what to do next. It might have an email address or a link to a web form or a phone number to call. And certainly when it's spelled out like that, and really super clear, it's much easier to be able to request the accommodations that you need. However, if it is not that explicit in any type of the material, or you don't have a recruiter proactively ask if you require any reasonable accommodations for the interview process, it is completely okay to ask. And, you know, to say, for instance, you know, I am deaf, and in order to have effective communication during this virtual interview, I will require an ASL interpreter to be present, or I will require that captions, either AI captions or CART, be provided or be enabled. And so asking for those things that you're going to need, being a self-advocate through self-disclosure, I think that's something that we haven't talked about at all yet, is that in a lot of ways, self-disclosure is an on-ramp to self-advocacy.
Yes.
And nobody knows what you need better than you do. And if you don't know exactly what you need, getting really clear on that in terms of the assistive tech and the O&M and the flexibility that you require to be your best, most productive self, is a really good thing to do your homework on. And then in that regard, the self-disclosure conversation starts to become less about, let me tell you about my disability, and more about, here are the things that I require in order to be the most productive employee. You will come to find through the interview process whether or not I am the most qualified candidate. However, let's be really honest. Every employee needs tools to be their most productive self. Can a graphic designer do their job with a drafting table and a bunch of number 2 pencils? Absolutely. Are they going to be much more effective and efficient if you give them Adobe Creative Suite? For sure. Reframing the disability disclosure conversation from let me tell you about my disability to let me tell you about the tools and resources I need to be the most productive employee, is a really empowering way to shift the paradigm around disclosure.
And we, as an employer, an employer should realize that all of their employees are interdependent. And, you know, and not that that's something you would point out, but you want to remind them what skills you have to offer to bring to the team.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question here. So wondering if you have any advice about how to disclose a need for flexible work hours due to some medical challenges.
Great question. And I think that is one that is becoming increasingly relevant right now, with post-pandemic and hybrid or virtual work. And I think again, some of that is dependent upon where you work. Employers of 50 or more employees have requirements under federal law, FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, which includes intermittent leave, which provides really clear guidelines and protections for things like what was asked around medical appointments. If you work at a much smaller employer of 50 or less, those conversations take on a little bit different dimensionality, just based upon FMLA not being a provision. And so just having the conversation and determining how or when to self-disclose, but again, positioning it as, how do you talk from a position of self-advocacy would be my recommendation. And I know we're coming up on time. I will offer, Katie and team. I'm happy to answer any questions that came in that we didn't get to via email if you and the team want to send them my way. Anybody who's connected, you can find me on LinkedIn, Russell Shaffer, RussellShaffer. I'm also on Twitter, but don't check it often. And Richard said you'll never give out my email, but he didn't say I can't. So I'm russell@disabilityin.org. And would love to hear from you all, and just am really grateful for the opportunity to join APH for the first employment connection.
Russell, Lori, I'm sorry, Lori, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say there's some great questions in the chat, and if you would like to email connectcenter@aph.org, would be nice if I could speak. You know, we could definitely reach out to you. We also have some blogs that cover some of the issues I saw come through.
Yes.
So we can help direct you to those as well. And we will be doing this quarterly. So if you have topics that you're interested in, we don't know yet what our next topic is going to be, but
we have several in mind, but
we have a page and a half in mind.
Yeah. And don't forget, for those who are listening, we will give out the closing codes in just a minute, but on May the, tell me what date, 4th, May the 4th be with you. We are interviewing Jeff Bishop with Microsoft for our career conversations, which happens monthly, as I said in the chat, excluding July and August. We want to thank you all for attending, Russell. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so very much. And we can't wait to have you back in September, I believe, for career conversations. And Lori and Katie, as always, thank you for being amazing.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. And Katie is going to pause the recording for the code.
Absolutely.